Hey, I'm Aurelia. I'm a relationship therapist, and today I want to take you through a guided workshop that I've been doing with quite a few of my clients lately who are struggling to prioritize their own self-care because they're so caught up in the struggles that are going on within their relationship. So if you are struggling in your relationship, and particularly if you have been for some time, I can probably confidently bet everything I own that you are exhausted. Okay, so mentally, emotionally, probably physically as well. And you probably have this sense that you're at breaking point and that your self-care is at an all-time low. But at the same time, it feels like there is just so much to do, and any crumb of downtime you might get ends up then wasted on conflict. So you feel like there's not enough time in the week to do everything you need to get done. And if you waste time on something as frivolous as self-care, it's just all going to fall apart. And you might laugh at this, but you probably are actually seeing self-care as a luxury, right? Like you probably view it as less important than almost everything else that's going on. By the way, I'm using this template for our session today, and there's a link to that template in the description if you'd like to follow along. The template is free. So this workshop is for you if you're feeling really burnt out and you're at your wit's end and you kind of know it's unsustainable and that your mental and emotional health is suffering, but you're also struggling with mental resistance and guilt about spending some of that really limited time focused on your own needs. So this session is about starting to challenge that internal voice that tells you to deprioritize yourself and your own self-care, right? That tells you there's no time and there are more important things to worry about. So these questions are designed as kind of a gentle push for your brain to reframe the way that we approach self-care. Now, before we get into the guided session, I want to explain how self-care kind of fits in with relationship care. So you could think of a relationship as a car with 3 fuel tanks. Fuel tank number 1 is the fuel the relationship runs on. And you fill that fuel tank up with positive interactions, physical and emotional intimacy, shared goals and dreams, happy memories, and so on. And you use some of that fuel every time you argue, when you have to work through challenges together as a couple, when you need to talk through difficult issues together, and so on. Then you have these other 2 tanks, which are our and our partner's individual energy tanks. And we fill these tanks when we have time to recharge with downtime, when we engage in self-care, so when we get sleep, emotional support, time to pursue our own goals and interests, time to connect with old friends, to be ourselves, to improve our self-esteem, and so on. And we start to deplete this tank anytime we do something which requires mental or emotional energy, right? So our job draws energy from this tank. Supporting a friend going through a rough time draws energy from this tank. Household chores, dealing with a busy schedule, personal struggles with self-esteem, health issues, anything that you can think of which requires us to expend mental, emotional, or physical energy draws from that tank. Now, the most interesting part is that these 3 tanks are not completely independent, right? They borrow from one another. So if one partner is really struggling and running on empty, they might start drawing energy from their partner's tank or the relationship tank in order to keep themselves afloat. If the relationship tank is low, you might start filtering in your personal energy to keep it going. Now, this borrowing process is really natural, right? And in a well-functioning relationship, it's a back and forth process that works really well. But when all 3 tanks are running on empty, because there's very little refueling happening within the relationship, we are drawing more energy with conflict than we are replacing with fun and positive interactions and intimacy and so on. And then your tank is empty because you were desperately trying to keep the relationship going, on top of keeping your own and your family's daily life together. Eventually the car just stops running. And now you are outside trying to physically push the car on your own down like an endless desert road, telling me that you don't have time to stop for a drink of water. And you're behaving as if you think you can do that indefinitely. But it can absolutely be really difficult to make that mental shift from self-care as a guilty pleasure or luxury we don't have time for, to self-care as a non-negotiable priority that's actually essential not just for our own mental health, but for our relationship as well. The first question asks us to take a couple of minutes to compassionately acknowledge the reasons that it's so difficult to prioritize our own self-care. I think when we first tell somebody, okay, you need to prioritize yourself a bit more, let's up the self-care a little bit, there's immediately this kind of mental resistance where they might politely respond and say, yeah, I know. But internally we're thinking, okay, how am I supposed to do that, right? So I'm not sleeping well, my schedule's out of order, I've got to do the majority of the housework and the childcare, I have a job. So there's all these forms of mental resistance that pop up. There might be some guilt as well, right? So we feel like if we're spending time just focus on our own goals and our own needs, then we're neglecting other people. We feel a bit selfish for doing that, right? And when your brain is bringing up these anxieties and these forms of guilt, it's a little bit like a smoke alarm, right? So, if a smoke alarm goes off because we burnt some toast or something like that, it doesn't just stop going off because we ignore it. We actually have to go and reassure the smoke alarm, push the button and say, hey, look, thanks for the warning, but everything's fine here. And stress, anxiety, mental resistance, guilt, it's a little bit the same. If you just ignore it, your brain's actually going to double down on that resistance. So it works a lot better to acknowledge those forms of resistance that are coming up and compassionately explore it for a little while before we move on. Okay, so whilst all of these reasons are valid, the reality of the situation is that if we can't find a way to carve out some real committed space for ourselves, nothing's going to change, right? Like, you can't expect your brain to keep pushing at the level you are currently pushing indefinitely, okay? Eventually, something has to give. And so this question's about exploring, like, what impact is this lack of self-care having on you at the moment, right? Is it that your sleep isn't getting any better? Is your self-esteem low? A really common one is this sense that we are losing our sense of personal identity, like who are we outside of the relationship, because all of our energy is being filtered into the relationship. Another thing to consider is that when we don't provide our brain with some kind of healthy self-care, it's going to find its own way to decompress. And usually those kind of last-ditch attempts to get some form of escape are not necessarily the most helpful in the long term, right? So it tends to be we grab cigarettes or a bottle of wine or, we eat our body weight in Uber Eats or pizza. If that's you, welcome to the club. I have jackets. But the point is that your brain is going to find a way if you don't provide it with one. So let's just have a quick explore of, how this lack of time for ourselves is affecting us at the moment, and potentially even thinking about, what's going to happen if we continue that way. And then question 3 says, well, look, if nothing's changed a year down the track, so if things are still as they are 12 months from now, what would that be like? How is that going to feel? How am I going to manage that? Question 4 says, what is the worst that could realistically happen if I committed 15 to 30 minutes of uninterrupted me time every weekday and a little bit more one day each weekend? Before you absolutely attack me here, I absolutely get that your initial reaction is going to be, lady, what planet are you from where I get 5 minutes alone to pee, let alone 30 minutes of me time every weekday? I had the exact same reaction, right? But this question is about challenging that suspicion and that resistance just a little bit, right? As an experiment, humor me, okay? What's the worst that could realistically happen? Now, that's not to say that there's no negative consequences, right? Like if I put off cleaning the kitchen so that I have a bit of time for journaling or whatever it is, like it matters that now I have to live in a filthy kitchen or whatever it is, right? If I put off, things within the relationship or with my job, there is an impact, right? There are consequences. But the end of the question asks you to say, okay, sure, but then how does that compare to the consequences that we looked at in the previous section where we're still trying to perform at this level mentally a year down the track? What's going to happen then? Now, the final question says, okay, what if you could commit to prioritizing yourself? How might that change things? How might that feel? Right? How might life be different a year from now if we could commit to a bit more self-care. And I think it's natural for there to be a little bit of mental resistance here as well, right? Because for me, at least in the beginning, when people were recommending self-care tips to me, they felt really trivial in comparison to the enormity of what I was going through within my relationship. So when somebody said, okay, well, you need to eat a bit healthier, get a bit more sleep, get to the gym, do some journaling, etc., those things felt very small, and I thought, like, how could these things possibly make a significant difference to what I'm going through right now? So if that stuff is coming up for you, I think just know that it's very normal to feel that way. But I would challenge you to think about, okay, let's talk about an ideal world where you can find something that really helps, right? So you prioritize yourself for 15 minutes a day and maybe 30 minutes on the weekend, and you use that time to do something that really does help. How would it feel a year from now if things could improve? What would that look like for you? So best of luck with getting that self-care back on track, reducing some of the guilt around it. And if you found the workshop interesting or helpful, feel free to like, subscribe, or comment. See you next time.